All right, so now that we've created the basic components for our front end, let's actually display those inside our app component and talk about how our front end is going to approach communicating with the back end. So first of all, let's import the components we created. We're going to import our new to-do form, and we're going to import our to-do list. All right, we don't need to import the to-do list item because that is automatically displayed by the to-do list. All right, so the way that this is going to work, and I'm just adjusting my indentation there. The way that this is going to work is we're going to basically display our to-do list app all inside its own div here. Under that, we're going to say new to-do form. And for the on-click create prop, we're going to pass in our own function, which I'll get to in just a minute. For now, we'll just leave that blank. And underneath our new to-do form, we're going to display our to-do list with its to-dos prop, which I'll get to in a second again. And for on-complete to-do, we're going to pass in our own function. And for on-delete to-do, we're also going to pass in our own function. So all of the parts that I've left blank here are basically where communicating with the server comes into play, right? Obviously, when we call on-click create from our new to-do form, we're going to want to make a request to the server telling it, hey, we want to create a new to-do with this text, right? And with our to-dos prop and our to-do list, that's where we're going to want to load the to-dos right when our application starts, okay? And likewise with on-complete to-do, we're going to want to update our to-dos, and on delete to-do, we're going to want to send a request to the server telling it we want to delete a given to-do. So the way that this is going to work, I'm just going to discuss the create, complete, and delete ones for the time being. We're just going to have a separate function for each of those that makes a corresponding request to the server. So we'll have a function for creating a to-do. We'll say create to-do, and that's going to take the to-dos text as an argument. And inside here, right, this is where we're going to make our actual network request. So we'll just leave that blank for now. Underneath that, we're going to have our function for marking a to-do as completed. For that, we'll say const complete to-do equals, and we're going to take the to-do's ID as an argument. And inside here, oops, I said const twice. Let's delete that. Inside this function now is where we're going to make a request to the server telling it we want to mark a given to-do as completed. And under that, we're going to have our delete to-do function, which will also take a to-do ID as an argument. And as you may have guessed, we're going to make a request to the server telling it we want to delete a given to-do. Okay, so that's going to be our basic strategy with doing those kind of operations with our to-dos, and we'll see what the actual requests look like shortly. But loading to-dos is going to be a little bit different. Essentially, what we're going to do for that is import the use state hook and store all of the current to-dos for our application in a state in our app component. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say const to-dos and set to-dos equals use state, and the initial value of our to-dos is just going to be an empty array. Okay, so basically nothing will be displayed in our application until we actually load our to-dos. So we'll pass those to-dos to our to-do list right now, even though they're just blank. Essentially, the strategy we have to take when we're loading to-dos is we want to load our to-dos right when our app component is first rendered. Now, as you may remember, the way that we do this in React is by using the use effect hook. Okay, so essentially when we're loading data inside one of our components, it's gonna generally take the same form, which is this one. We're gonna say use effect, and we want this effect only to be called when the app component is first rendered, so we pass an empty array as the second argument here. And inside this use effect, what we're going to do is define an asynchronous function that will actually load the data for us. So we'll say something like const load to-dos equals async, and then we'll actually call that function here. And the reason we do it this way, and the reason we can't just put async right there on use effect, is because use effect doesn't allow asynchronous callbacks. So unfortunately, we just have to define it inside this use effect callback like we're doing here. Okay, and inside this load to-dos function is where we're going to actually make that request to the server that will load our to-dos for us. Okay, so let's just pass the other functions here to their corresponding props. So for onClick create, we'll say create to-do. For onComplete to-do, we'll say complete to-do. And for onDelete to-do, we'll say delete to-do. All right, and before I show you how to make requests from the front end, let's actually go to the back end and create those basic endpoints that will allow us to do things like create, delete, etc. for our to-dos. So first of all, before we add MongoDB, which in itself is a pretty involved process, in order to allow ourselves to at least build out the server and get an idea of how it's going to work, what I usually like to do is create just a basic in-memory database, right? Which is just an in-memory array that will get erased when the server is restarted. And for now, let's just create a fake to-dos array. So we'll say const fake to-dos equals, and inside here we'll create our to-dos that we'll just use for development purposes for the time being. So we're going to say ID 123, the text. For this one, we'll just say go to the grocery store. And for is completed, we'll say false. And we'll just make one more fake to do. That ID will be 234. The text for that one will be something like learn full stack development. And that one's sort of partially completed, so we'll say is completed. I don't know, just so that we can see the difference between completed to-dos, we'll mark that one as true. Okay? So now that we have those fake to-dos, we can actually build out our basic endpoints for our application. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how each of these endpoints works or, the syntax behind it. So first of all, let's delete this app.get test endpoint. And we're going to create 4 endpoints for the 4 different operations that our application is going to need to perform. So the first one is going to be for loading our to-dos. So for that one, we'll say app.get. And the path for this one is going to be /to-dos. That's just sort of a RESTful convention for REST APIs. And for the callback, we're going to say request response. And all we're going to do for this one is send back our fake to-dos to the client. And the way we're going to do that is by saying response.send fake to-dos. Okay? And in situations where we're sending back a JSON object, as we are here, what's usually recommended to do is to say res.json instead of res.send, although both of them will work in this case. All right, so that is our read endpoint, right? The endpoint that will allow our application to load to-dos. So let's restart our server by killing it with Control-C and then running node server, rephrase, and then running node source/server.js. And we should see that it says server is listening on port 8080. All right, so first of all, you can test this by going to localhost 8080/to-dos and hitting enter. And what you'll see is that we get back the JSON data corresponding to the fake to-dos that we're sending back to the client. Okay, so essentially all we need to do on our front end is have our front end be the one that makes this request instead of our browser as we're doing here. Now the way that works is on our front end, we're going to first of all install a package called Axios. Now, Axios is just a very helpful package that makes network requests in React very easy to perform. So we're going to hit enter, and that will install that package for us. And the way we're going to use that to load data from our backend is by saying import Axios from Axios. And down here in our load to-dos function, we're going to say const response equals await, because it is asynchronous. All server requests are going to be asynchronous because they take a long time in computer terms. And we're going to say axios.get, and we basically have to specify the endpoint we want to send this request to. So there's a few ways we can do this. One way is by actually specifying the full localhost 8080/to-dos. Okay, And I'll show you what happens when we do that in just a minute. But anyway, once we've made that request, we have our response, and we're going to want to update our to-dos state to the to-dos that the backend sent back to us. So how that's going to work, all of that data is just going to be in response.data. Okay, that's just how Axios works there. So what we're going to do is say set to-dos response.data. All right. Now this won't actually work yet for one main reason, and you can see that reason if you run your application with npm run start. Okay, if you open up your terminal now in your running to-dos application, you're going to see something that's very common when you're first getting started with full stack development, and that is something called a CORS policy, okay? So essentially what this means is that our website doesn't like the fact that it's sort of straddling between two different origins, right? We have our localhost 8080 and localhost 3000. Now, in production, we'll usually have our front end and back end served from the same port, so that won't be a problem. But in development, the way that we get around this is either by adding something to the server, or my preferred way of doing this is to go into package.json inside our front end and adding a proxy property to it with the URL of our backend. So http localhost 8080 / and what this actually allows us to do is inside our front end now, whenever we want to make a request to the server, we don't have to specify this initial part here. We can just say axios.get /todos, and that will also get rid of the CORS error that we saw for reasons that I won't go into right now. And in order for this to work, we do have to restart our front end. I always get confused when I run into the errors that I get from that. So we'll restart our front end, and that should make it work, right? So we see that we have now loaded data from our backend and we're displaying it inside our front end. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.